What if I told you that the most influential pastor of the 19th century was actually a teenager who stumbled into the wrong church on a snowy day and his life changed forever? This is the story of Charles Spurgeon. Well, they asked him to come back and preach again, so he preached again, and then eventually they're like, yes, we want you to be our pastor.
That's 17.
Yes. Here's what's even crazier. They said, we can't pay you. Like, we really can't afford to pay you, so here's what we'll do. We'll host you. But it wasn't living with one family, because there wasn't one family that just like had enough room that they could host him. 56 families lined up to host him. And so each week he lived with a different family in the church. And in fact, there were so many families who were willing to host him that by the end of the year, he spent a week with a different family, and there were still families who had yet to host him. So think about, like, just imagine how well you'd get to know people, like living among them.
Yeah.
And in a few months, the church grew from 20 to 80 to about 400 and 450. And Keith, we've walked through some of famous historical Christian figures. We've looked at Adoniram Judson. We've looked at Hudson Taylor. And we're getting ready to do, to kick off our in our youth group, we're looking at history makers. I stole the title from you. We've done it in the past, but I really like that title.
I know I might bring back some history makers.
Well, and even just looking at some of them, like we're gonna do George Mueller, we're gonna do Gladys Allward, and I'm like reading these stories, and I'm like, goodness, like one, I want to start documenting more of my life, because they documented so many things that we can actually go back and and find these stories, like Mueller with his prayers that they were answered and stuff. And Allward, when she said, I'm sure that I was not God's first choice to go to China. It must have been a man, a strong man that came to me.
He just like didn't obey or something. So God's like, oh, she's willing.
Yeah. And, but Spurgeon is interesting to me because, he's called the Prince of Preachers. And when you kind of hear, because he produced so much work, which we'll look at in his life, so much of his work was preserved. And so we have so many sermons and quotes and works from Spurgeon because of how meticulous he was in recording everything and documenting everything. But when I started to actually dig more into his life, I was like, man, this is such a great figure for teenagers to know about because of Spurgeon's life. And so we're going to just kind of walk through chronologically through his life and his story. And then at the end, we might look back and maybe take some reflections of what we can get out of this. But he was born in Essex, England in 1834, so kind of Victorian England. And his parents were not very wealthy. And so when he was 2 years old, he was the oldest. When he was 2, he was sent to live with his grandparents. And that was critical for a couple things. His grandfather was an itinerant preacher, so he would travel around, and his grandparents didn't have a lot of money either. And as a 5-year-old, his grandmother offered him money. She would pay him for every hymn he learned. But what's interesting is his grandfather offered him money for every rat he caught in the house. And so at the age of 5, he would get money for every rat he caught in the house. And at that time, he was like, it's recorded, he's like, as a 5-year-old, I thought catching rats was much more fun than learning hymns. But his grandfather, being an itinerant preacher, had an extremely large library, a Puritan library. And so Spurgeon began to read the Puritan authors even at a young age. And so at a very young age, he became, he was very knowledgeable theologically, but he felt an extreme burden of his sin even at a young age. And so he really struggled growing up with the fact that he didn't feel worthy of being saved because he felt such a weight and such shame with his sin. And so he did not make, while growing up in a Christian household, he eventually went to live back with his parents once they were able to get finances settled. Even though he grew up in a Christian household, he did not make a profession of faith at a really young age. And in fact, it wasn't until he was 15 that he trusted Christ. And when I read this story, it was like mind blowing. So I want to read it. Or you want to go ahead and read it for our listeners?
Say, please, can I cover the conversion story? So bitterly cold Sunday morning, January 1850. So 15-year-old C.H. or Charles Haddon Spurgeon. I don't know if he knew his middle name. Haddon? Yeah. So Charles Haddon Spurgeon was restless, burdened by the weight of his sin, desperate to find peace with God. A snowstorm had rolled in, and on his way to church, he ducked into a small primitive Methodist chapel on Artillery Street, almost by accident. The regular minister hadn't made it because of the snow, so a layman stood up to preach. Untrained and simple, he opened the Bible and read aloud from Isaiah 45:22. The passage was, "Look unto me, and be ye saved, all the ends of the earth." he didn't have much to say, so he just repeated the verse again and again. Which, by the way, like if you ever don't know what to say, just read God's word. Like that's the sermon of itself. So I think this is a powerful illustration of that too. So if you don't have time to prepare a sermon, don't make something up. Just read God's word. So yeah, he didn't have much to say, so he just repeated the verse again and again. Look to Jesus, look to him and live. Then mid-sermon, he fixed his eyes on Charles and said, "Young man, you look very miserable." Sometimes we just got to call students out, right? It says, "You will always be miserable, miserable in life, miserable in death, unless you obey the word of God. Look to Christ." And in that moment, Charles Spurgeon later said, "I saw at once the way of salvation. I looked until I could have almost looked my eyes away. The cloud was gone, the darkness rolled away, and I saw the sun." The teenager who walked into that chapel frozen in despair walked out radically transformed. That simple command, look to Jesus, changed the course of his life and the lives of millions through his preaching.
Hey everyone, we're so excited to continue to share more about Charles Spurgeon and his life and what it means for us. But the reason why we love going back and looking at these historical Christian figures is really they're an inspiration to us to look at what they accomplished with what God gave them and how God worked powerfully through them. And we know that God can do the same thing today, and he is working through each and every one of you. And we just want to be, as Hebrews 12:1 says, a great cloud of witnesses, that we would all continue to encourage, train, and equip one another to reach this next generation for Christ. And one of the ways we do that here at the Beyond the Youth Room is through our online community youth ministry mastermind. The Youth Ministry Mastermind is completely free of charge. We have nothing to sell you. It's filled with free resources, live trainings, like-minded youth pastors and leaders around the United States and the world, all working together to reach the next generation for Christ. And so if you're looking for encouragement, if you're looking for resources, if you're just looking to continue to improve as a youth pastor, youth director, youth leader, we would love for you to join the Youth Ministry Mastermind. The easiest way to do that, check out the link in the description below. It takes 30 seconds to join. Click that link, and it's, again, all free. And when you join, I'll reach out, me, Ryan, hoping to set up a time just to talk with you, just to hear what God is doing in your ministry, be a listening ear, maybe provide encouragement, perspective, help you wrestle with any challenges or think through anything that you're currently trying to navigate. Again, we just want to be a resource and support you as you continue to make disciples who make disciples. So go ahead, check out that link in the description below, join the Youth Ministry Mastermind today, and then we hope you enjoy the rest of this episode. Yeah. So a couple even more interesting anecdotes behind the story when I read the full one. So he was walking to the church that he was normally a part of. He was a part of a Congregationalist church at this age. Well, not a part of, but he went to. And it was so icy that he was like, I'm never going to make it there. But he felt like, hey, I should just go to church somewhere. And so that's why I ended up at this primitive Methodist chapel. And so he walked in. You can see a picture of where this chapel, what it looked like. And he said there was like 10 people there. Now, I don't know if there's normally 10 people there, if it was just because like the snowy conditions. Yeah. So there's like 10 people there. He sits down and he said that it was so awkward because, they were supposed to have a guest preacher who couldn't get there. And so everybody just kind of sat there in silence because everybody was like, back then, like the preacher did everything. Like the preacher got up, like led the hymns, like, did the invitation, everything. And so he says, like, everybody just kind of sat there. And eventually this old guy just like was like, well, okay. And he got up, and that's when he gave his sermon. And so there was like 10 people in this crowd. And so if you're a youth pastor and you're like, man, like we don't have a big, like imagine being the guy who's like, I led Charles Spurgeon to Christ, and like look what he's done.
Faithfulness, faithfulness to show up.
It was really, really cool.
Yeah, and I think part of this story too reminds me just a conversation that I had. So there was we just finished our camp season in our church, and I had gone to our high school camp and our middle school camp, but then my third son, Dawson, who he's just old enough to go to our Kids Quest camp, and he's like, Dad, will you please come be a camp leader? I'm like, oh. So literally got home from middle school camp Sunday night, left Monday morning for our Kids Quest camp for 5 days. And I was like, man, but I was like, you know what? Like the Lord, the Lord's working. So, anyways, we just had a small group of guys, that I was the cabin leader for. And so after one of the messages, I mean, it was a similar situation like this. It wasn't like I was preaching a sermon at this point, but I literally just I was like, you know what? I'm just going to ask every single, these are all like 8, 9, 7 to 9-year-olds, boys. I was like, I'm just going to ask them, like, are you following Jesus? Yeah. Are you following? And like, we just went around one by one, and we got this one kid, and he's like, no. He's like, I know about Jesus, but I don't think I'm following him. And so I was like, well, what stops you right now from trusting Christ? And he's like, no, nothing. I was like, well, do you want to just give your life to Christ right now? And he's like, yeah. And so right then, so I would just say, never underestimate just like that pointed invitation, like not to just like a blanket, like general invitation. It's like, is there anyone that wants to? It's like, hey, do you want to follow Christ? Like, and I think that's what kind of, got his attention, because I'm sure he was probably just trying to blend in, like in the background. It's like, this is so awkward. Like, one of 10 people here, no one's talking. But then, young man, you look very miserable. Are you always be miserable in life and miserable in death unless you obey the word of the Lord? Look to Christ. And that was what the Lord needed to use to get his attention.
Yeah. Yeah. So he was 15 at this time. My actual favorite story is this. So he then he went off to school and he joined a Baptist church at this point. And he joined a ministry for itinerant preaching. So of course at that time, like a lot of country churches, small churches couldn't afford to have a pastor, and so many Sundays, like they were relying on a guest preacher. And so he was like, look, like I want to serve God. Like this seems like a way I can do that. And so he volunteered to be a part of this ministry of lay preachers that it was through this church that they would send guys out to go speak at different churches. And the pastor who's leading it one day said, hey, there's a young man who's going to be giving his first sermon, and I'm a little nervous for him. He goes, so I'd feel better if he had somebody with him. Hey, would you mind going to this church? And so Spurgeon's like, yeah, I'd be willing to do that. And so on the way there, the guy that he was accompanying was a little bit older than him. And on the way there, Spurgeon finally looks at him and goes, hey, so what passage are you preaching on? And the guy was like, what do you mean? And he was like, what passage are you preaching on? He goes, I'm not preaching, you're preaching. And he was like, no, the pastor said there was a young man who was going to be giving his first sermon and he was kind of nervous, so he'd feel better if somebody went with him. He was like, yeah, he was talking about you. He's like, he asked me if I'd be willing to come with you because you're the one preaching. So Spurgeon found out that he was going to be preaching his first sermon on the way to the first sermon in the carriage ride and began to put things together. And this was when he was, I believe, 16. He might have been 17 at the time. But he ended up preaching at a church. I don't know if you pronounce it Waterbach or Water Beach, but they ended up hearing him preach. And think about this. This is the craziest part of this whole story. Okay. Maybe because we work with 17-year-olds. Yeah. But when Spurgeon was 17, this church invited him to be their pastor.
So based on his first sermon ever that he found out.
I can't remember if it was his very first sermon but it was one of his first. Yeah. Yes, but it might have been his very first.
Like, we got to get this guy.
Well, they asked him to come back and preach again. So he preached again. And then eventually they're like, yes, we want you to be our pastor.
That's 17.
Yes. Yeah. Here's what's even crazier. They said, we can't pay you. Like, we really can't afford to pay you. So here's what we'll do. We'll host you. But it wasn't living with one family, because there wasn't one family that just like had enough room that they could host him. 56 families lined up to host him. And so each week he lived with a different family in the church. And in fact, there were so many families who were willing to host him that by the end of the year, he spent a week with a different family, and there were still families who had yet to host him. So think about, like, just imagine how well you'd get to know people, like living among them.
Yeah.
And in a few months, the church grew from 20 to 80 to about 400 and 450. And you can see pictures of this church. They were standing outside because there wasn't enough room. Wow. And so he had deacons around him who were kind of, kind of like the elder statesmen, kind of like looking over him and stuff. But they were just blown away, and people came from all around. And so from the age of 17 to 19, he pastored this church. And I think they even grew a little bit larger than that. And it was one day that there was a church in London called New Park Street Church. And they wrote to him. They wrote to a deacon and said, hey, can he come and preach? We'd love for him to come guest preach. And the deacon gave it to him. And Spurgeon looked at him and read it and goes, do they know I'm 19? And he was like, yeah. And he's like, are you sure they know I'm 19? He was like, yes, I made sure I checked like before. So he's like, no, have them write back and make sure they know I'm 19. And so they wrote back, and the response came, they're like, yep, we're well aware of your age. Like, we want you to come preach. So he goes and preach. And the reason why he was so nervous is because this was like a prominent church that had fallen on hard times. They'd had a couple of prominent pastors and before in their history, but they'd been without a pastor for a while. So he goes and he speaks, and they come up to him afterwards and they're like, hey, like, we want you to come, and would you mind speaking a few more times? And at this point, his church back in Water Beach, like, they were kind of like, they knew what was going to happen. And so this church, he's 19 at this time. This church heard him preach 3 more times. They said, hey, we want to we want you to be our pastor on a 6-month basis, and then we'll talk once it's over. Well, Spurgeon hated the city so much that he said, let's make it a 3-month basis. And it wasn't because he wanted to pressure him into a decision. It was because he was like, I'm going to hate this so much that I'm not going to do this. And he goes, in case they quickly realize yeah, I'm too young. This isn't it. He's like, I want to give them a way out. And so at the age of 19, he started a 3-month trial basis, and 2 months in, they came to him unanimously, and they said, no, we want you to be our pastor. And he said, okay. So he became the pastor in 1854 of New Park Street Church in London. And within a couple months, the attendance grew from 200 to over 1,000. And what's interesting here is, so you kind of see, we always like to talk about the hardships that people face as well. It wasn't just, a boom in attendance, because in fact, in 1853 and 1854, there was a cholera outbreak in London. And so at the age of 20, this cholera outbreak took the lives of 10,739 people and sickened many else. And they didn't realize at the time that cholera was actually spread through contaminated water. They thought it was contagious. And so Spurgeon, at the age of 20, went to visit the people in his church who were sick. And in fact, he said he did a funeral a day, sometimes even a whole family. And so when you think back on when you were 20, imagine if you had to do a funeral every day.
Yeah, that would have been formational for sure.
Yeah, and so he really struggled with this, and he was so worried that he was going to get sick again because they didn't know it was contaminated water at the time, and so he just really struggled through this. So it wasn't just he was a great preacher; this was his character, this was his makeup. And so the church continued to grow. One of my favorite stories. All right. 1855. So he'd been there, He'd been there 1 year, year and a half. The church was so full that people stood outside, and they would open some of the windows so people could listen. Well, the church was really stuffy, and of course didn't have air conditioning. And so Spurgeon went to the deacons and said, "Hey, can we open up some of the top windows that were kind of stained glass, just like decor windows?" He said, "Can we open some of those? It's so stuffy." And they're like, "Yeah, we'll get to it." And so he was just sweating so much. So he came to him again. He's like, "No, can we open up? I'm dying. Can we open these up?" And they're like, "Yeah, we'll get to it." And so one morning they came in, and the windows had been smashed out. And
it's vandalism.
Yes. And they came to Spurgeon, and they were like, "Somebody smashed the windows." And he was like, "Are you serious?" And they're like, "Yeah." They're like, we need to figure out who did this. They're like, we're gonna offer a reward for whoever did this." And Spurgeon was like, "No, it's really not necessary. Guys, we don't need to worry about it." And years later, Spurgeon, he was like, "Yeah, I was the one who smashed out the windows." He was like, "I was so tired of sweating that he went in at night and smashed the windows so he would have a breeze." And then the deacons were like, "We need to figure out who did this." Yeah. And he was like, "Yeah, guys, I'm not worried about figuring it out." Yeah. And there's another version of the story. I wish this was the true version because it'd be a whole lot cooler. One version of the story says that he offered a 5-pound reward for whoever could give evidence that would lead to a conviction. And so he offered up the $5, and then secretly he just pocketed the $5 because he's like, "Well, I know who did it, so I guess I get the reward."
That's a mystery that was never solved somehow. Yeah.
Yeah. So 2021, the church grew from 200 to about 1,200. But in those days, it was very common for sermons to appear in the press or critics to go and listen to people preach. And Spurgeon was in Victorian England, and so the time of those days, the reason why Spurgeon was so popular is he said, "Let's talk to people in plain language. Let's not use this big, highfalutin, academic, theological. Let's just talk to people in a way that they can understand." And so there were some press critiques of Spurgeon.
I love these.
I was going to ask if you could read them.
So one person wrote, "A mere lad, calling his sermons redolent and bad taste, vulgar and theatrical." Spurgeon reportedly replied, "I am perhaps vulgar." He's like, "Yeah, I'll admit that. But I must and will make the people listen." That's awesome. Pulpit buffoonery is another critic. Pulpit buffoonery. I love, yeah. What if someone said that you were a pulpit buffoonery? And in utter ignorance of theology, critics accused his sermons of being irreverent and unsuited to serious doctrine. "That the most solemn mysteries of our holy religion are by him rudely, roughly, and impiously handled. Common sense is outraged and decency disguised," another critic said. And then, of course...
Hold on. This is my favorite one, so I want to make sure.
"A coarse, stupid, irrational bigot." Even his prayers were condemned as irreverent, presumptuous, and blasphemous. Yeah. So he was criticized.
Yeah, and all of this at 20, 21 years old. So imagine like you're hearing this, you're seeing this, like you'd become very discouraged. And a fact that we might touch on later on is that Spurgeon struggled with depression for his entire life. He really struggled with depression, and so you can only imagine like hearing this in the press, hearing what people had to say about him. And there was times that he stood alone. Like there was times that he stood alone at that young age, overseeing all this, and which is just crazy to hear. So
well, there was a tragic event that happened that contributed to some of his depression as well. So 1856, the church had moved to services at Exeter Hall, which seated 4,000 people. Just imagine like going from like 200 people to 4,000 just in a few years.
And then they had to keep looking, and so so they went. And a little bit of backstory for this because it's important. So the church was like, hey, before we get to the tragedy, the church was like, hey, we have to make a decision. Like our building's not big enough. And so they said, if we're going to build a new building, we're going to have to fundraise. And so think about this like critical decision point. They had to make a determination. Are people just coming to see Spurgeon because he's a novelty, because he's young?
Yeah.
Or does this actually have staying power? And so they committed to a building program, which we'll talk about in a second. But throughout that building program, they had to find different places to meet. And so they met at Exeter Hall, which seated 4,000. But occasionally they would use the Surrey Gardens Music Hall, which could hold more. And so that's where the story picks up if you want to go ahead and read from there.
So 22 years old, Charles Spurgeon was already drawing crowds too large for any church building in London on the evening of October 19th. 1856, more than 10,000 people packed into the Surrey Gardens Music Hall, eager to hear him preach. The aisles overflowed. The balconies creaked under the weight of the crowd. So we're talking like this is wooden construction. Like this is not like steel beams, like theaters that we're used to now. As Spurgeon opened in prayer, some men in the gallery, seeking to cause a disruption, shouted, "Fire! The balconies are collapsing." And this is just a false accusation. Panic exploded. People surged towards the exits. Screams echoed. In the chaos, 7 people were trampled or crushed to death.
Yeah.
So this is like a really major accident. Dozens were more severely injured. Spurgeon was rushed from the stage in shock, unaware of the full horror unfolding behind him. That night shattered him. For weeks, he spiraled into deep depression. The weight of the tragedy and the sense of responsibility nearly crushed his young spirit, but Spurgeon did return to the pulpit, scarred but refined, with a new depth of compassion and urgency in his preaching. He later wrote, "I was laid very low. My spirits were sunken so that I could weep by the hour like a child, yet I knew not what I wept for." That's like the definition of depression, by the way. Like that is, so depression is like, I've heard it described like this, where it's like, okay, if you're sad because someone in your family passed away, like that's connected to, it's like, all right, I lost my job, like, or I'm going through this big life change. Like you can understand why you're sad, but it's like, if you're sad and you don't know why, that's depression.
Yeah.
Like and he described it that way.
Yeah. And his wife, Susanna, said he was never the same after that night. She said that like he eventually moved past it, like the ministry moved past it, the church moved past it, but he never moved past it. And he struggled with depression his whole life. And that was a pivotal moment. And they eventually did, I believe, do another service at the Surrey Gardens Music Hall. But it's just crazy. It's just crazy. And in fact, he actually preached at Crystal Palace in front of 24,000. Which is like for those times, it's just nuts.
Yeah.
And no microphone, like just acoustics and amphitheaters and all that stuff. But in 1861, the church finally moved into their Metropolitan Tabernacle, which still exists today, and it was built to accommodate 6,500 people. The total cost was £31,000, which is about $5 million in today's money. But that's not including the land and like to build a 6,500 seat facility like nowadays would be a whole lot more than that. Yeah. But interestingly enough, Spurgeon was so serious about building this that he raised half the money on his own by going and preaching at different churches. Wow. So he would go and preach at all these different churches. They'd give an offering. Half would go to the church. Half would go to their building campaign. And so you think of like the personal investment. This wasn't just like, hey, I'm a great preacher. Like you guys raise the money and then I'll do it. It's like, no, he was deeply invested. Yep. And so after that point, Spurgeon dealt with a lot of health issues. In fact, his wife, Susanna, had a sickness from her pregnancy. They had twin boys. and she was homebound for really the rest of their life.
Yeah. Was she bedridden for a long?
It just says homebound. So yeah, I think like, yeah, she was bedridden and then she was homebound, but she really didn't leave the house. She had a lot of difficulties. Spurgeon had a lot of health difficulties, but that didn't stop them. And so what we want to kind of finish with is the ministries of the church, because it'd be easy to be like, well, he just preached, right? Like he was just a great preacher. Like, but that's not reality.
Just before we even get to that, like preaching alone, like, I mean, but AJ was 22, 10,000 sermons.
Yep.
Like, just boggles my mind, like to be that young and to preach that much.
Yeah.
By the age of 22. So, yes, I mean, like, let's not overlook the work that he put into ministering the word. But then it wasn't just a flash pan. Like, he started ministries that ended up making a tremendous impact as well. Do you want to go over some of those?
Yeah. So this is kind of in the once the church moved into the Metropolitan Tabernacle, they kind of were able to settle, because I mean, at some point, like, you've probably done church in a box, like where you're renting a space or like different things, or you've been to a church plant, and you know how stressful that is and how hard it is to like really see things through. And so now they have their own building, and one of the first things they did is they built almshouses. So in 1864, they founded a ministry to care specifically for widows, and so at the height they had 17. Rooms connected to, or it was built right beside the tabernacle. And so it was free housing. It was completely funded through people of the church, and they took care of widows or longtime servants who couldn't go. And so you see where it's like, hey, true religion is this, to care for the widows and orphans. They cared for the widows. And then in 1867, they started caring for the orphans. And so in 1867, they built the Stockwell Orphanage, which was originally just for boys, but then in 1867 it started with boys, and then girls were added in 1879. And orphanages in those days, like they were workhouses, they were sweatshops. Like, they had to be able to fund the ministry, or excuse me, they had to be able to fund the orphanage. The only way to do that was to get these kids to work. And so sometimes even like the orphanages were profit enterprises. Like, hey, like by producing this stuff, like that's how we can make a living. And their orphanage was not like that. It was very different. And at its height, it housed 5,000 children. And
5,000 or 500?
500, 500 children. And many graduates became ministers, missionaries, or like just people who are really prominent in society. And it was all supported by the church, by Spurgeon's own offerings, and by his book royalties. And in fact, there's a story in a second that I'd love for you to read. But they said when Spurgeon came, all the kids lit up. Like, they all ran to him. And in fact, oftentimes, when we see great men of faith, sadly, their kids suffer the consequences for it. But that was not the case with Spurgeon. He and his wife had twin boys. And they said that like you never saw him light up more than when he came home to his boys. And both his boys followed in his footsteps, went into the ministry, and were pastors. And so it just shows his heart. But yeah, there's somebody accompanied him on a visit to the orphanage, and it was actually an American evangelist who wrote this. So this is a story of Spurgeon at the orphanage.
Well, and I think, we think of these men like historical Christian figures and just how great they were in front of audiences. And so rarely do you see like how they interact with people on an individual level. And I think this is a cool glimpse to kind of show his heart for ministry, even on a very personal, practical level. He says, one morning during a visit to Stockwell Orphanages, Charles Spurgeon was called to the bedside of a gravely ill boy. The child was approaching death, pale and frail among his classmates, and Spurgeon gently took the boy's hand in his own and said, Jesus loves you. He bought you with his precious blood, and he knows what is best for you. It seems hard for you to lie here and listen to the shouts of the healthy boys outside at play, but soon Jesus will take you home, and then he will tell you the reason, and you'll be so glad. Then placing his hand on the boy's head, he prayed, O Jesus, Master, this child is reaching out in his thin hand to find thine. Touch him, dear Savior, with thy loving warm clasp. Lift him as he passes the cold river, and his feet not be chilled by the water of death. Take him home to thine own good time. Comfort and cherish him till that good time comes. Show him thyself as he lies here, and let him see thee and know thee more and more as his loving Savior. Spurgeon then paused with a warm smile and asked, Now, dear, is there anything you would like? Would you like a little canary in a cage to hear him sing in the morning? Nurse, see that he has a canary tomorrow morning. Goodbye, my dear. You will see the Savior perhaps before I shall. So there's an American evangelist, John B. Goff, who witnessed the scene. Later reflected, he says, I had seen Mr. Spurgeon holding 6,500 persons in a breathless interest. But as he sat by the bedside of a dying pauper child, he was to me greater and grander than when swaying the mighty multitude at his will.
Yeah.
That was a cool, intimate moment that was captured. But just even just to have compassion on an individual like that, and to sit by his bedside as he was nearing his death.
Yeah. And so they were passionate about widows and orphans, and also passionate about training up young pastors. And so the Pastors College, which is still active today, is Spurgeon's College in London. It began with, there was a young man who wanted to go in the ministry, but didn't have the financial wherewithals to do so. And so Spurgeon personally said, look, I will commit to this guy training you, and I will pay out of my own pocket for this. And so he paid out of his own pocket for this guy to be trained in the ministry. And soon it grew to a couple more that he was training, that he was paying to be trained out of his own ministry. And eventually got to a point where they're like, we can't continue to pay this out of our own. Like, it's impossible. And so at its height, the Pastors College trained around 900 pastors. And we'll look at it in his lasting legacy in a second. But the church and Spurgeon covered the cost of their tuition and living needs. And so again, just how generous this church was to be able to give to all of these ministries and support all of these ministries. It wasn't just it wasn't just a performance each weekend. And in fact, Spurgeon, they also had, they're like, the list of things that they accomplished is just insane. Yeah. And so they also took his sermon and published it weekly. And so somebody would literally sit and transcribe the sermon as Spurgeon was preaching. He would get a copy of it on Tuesdays. He would go through it, put the edits back. They would make the edits, bring it to him, and then it was published the following Thursday. And the purpose of this was to get good theology into the hands of those who needed it. And so they sold it for 1 penny. And so it was available to all classes. And this became so widely circulated that at one point it was reaching over 25,000 readers a week, including missionaries, prisoners, and soldiers. It was translated into over 40 different languages. And it eventually they compiled all of these, and it totaled 63 volumes. In fact, they were so just prominent that and widely distributed that prior in the antebellum South, so pre-Civil War, Spurgeon, these sermons were going out, and so people had these, and Spurgeon came out and spoke against the sin of slavery. And in the American South, they held Spurgeon book burning parties because they were offended at what he said. But it just, to me, it was like, that's how widely circulated his sermons were, is that the fact that they had these and they came together. And so he preached on average about 7 to 10 times a week. The craziest stat, one year they had 87 church member meetings. like that to me is that alone would make me quit. 87 church member meetings to a point, to affirm new members, appoint new deacons, because they were keeping up with this. Yeah. And so this is all in the midst of this. And then he was like, let's start a monthly magazine. And so he started a monthly magazine called The Sword and the Trowel.
Sword and the Trowel, yeah.
Of course, which comes from Nehemiah.
To defend the faith, the sword, and to build up the church, the trowel.
Yep.
And begin in 1865, January.
Yep.
It's a monthly magazine that he edited until his death in 1892.
Yep.
Contained articles on theology, current events, social issues, book reviews, reports from his ministries, the orphanage, the college, etc. Promoted the work of young writers, missionaries, and fellow preachers. Even tackled controversial topics, false teaching. He was in essence the first content creator.
Yeah. This was
literally just pumping out content.
And this is where he went and he used this to kind of speak out against certain things. And so we didn't include in this episode for time purposes, but I'd encourage you to if you Google Charles Spurgeon and downgrade controversy, you'll see that he went against the entire denomination. And he didn't want to, but eventually got to a point where they were kind of slipping from biblical inerrancy, and he was like, no. And so it was this huge thing, and the sword and the trowel was kind of his way to do that.
Yeah, and of course, that comes from Nehemiah 4:17, where the workers rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem with the sword in one hand and the trowel in the other. And so he just, that's what he named the magazine after. Yep. Then you have his wife, Susanna Spurgeon's Book Fund.
Yep.
Okay, so you have 1875 was when it was founded. It was basically purpose, was to send free theological books to poor pastors in need, especially rural and bivocational ministers that couldn't afford to buy commentaries and theological books. And so after Susanna, Spurgeon underwent major surgery in 1869. So this was 6 years after her major surgery that kind of made her homebound.
Yep.
Rather than retreating into inactivity, she launched a ministry from her own home, one that would equip thousands of pastors with rich gospel-centered resources.
Yep.
So she began by sending out copies of Charles Spurgeon's books, which I think she had access to. Yeah. But that was
probably got a discount.
Lectures to my students, and the Treasury of David,
which was Spurgeon's commentary on the Psalms. Yeah.
And so wrote and fundraised directly through the Sword and the Trowel magazine, operated the ministry from her bedroom, managing letters, packing boxes, keeping detailed records, often included personal letters of encouragement and prayer with each shipment. I mean, you would think like, it's like, okay, so she's sending out a couple packages here and there. It's like, no. Over 200,000 theological books were distributed in her lifetime.
Free of charge.
Free of charge, yeah. They reached pastors in England, Scotland, Wales, and even India, Africa, Australia. The book fund ran for over 28 years, blessing generations of pastors. It was run entirely free of charge, a labor of love and faith.
Yeah. So to recap before we get to the lasting legacy, the preaching 10 times a week, the almhouses, the orphanage, the pastor's college, weekly sermon publications, Sword in the Trowel, book fund, all given away.
Yeah,
it's crazy to think of the generosity. And so here's where it all culminates in. Spurgeon was a pastor at New Park Street Chapel, eventually became Metropolitan Tabernacle for 38 years of his ministry. There were baptized and added to his church 14,460 people. That's
he was like the first mega church pastor.
I mean,
There was no other church that big.
The Book of Acts was a mega church. But
I mean, that was individual churches, though.
Let's debate that off camera. But
okay.
But yeah, no. There was other large churches, but yeah, like when you think of if there is such a thing as like, hey, if a church is a mega church, like this is the model for how to do this. Like this is the model for it to be just like, let's give so many things away. Like let's support so many things. And so it wasn't just 14,460. It was estimated that all who came to the church because of Spurgeon and his ministry went over 20,000. So they were also feeding other churches because think about this. There was many points during his ministry that members of the church couldn't go to church that Sunday because they couldn't get a seat. So like imagine being like, I'm a part of this church, but sometimes I physically can't go because there's no room for me. Wow. And so it also grew a lot of other churches in the area. In fact, he said that he thought there was not a seat in the Tabernacle in which someone had not been converted. 6,500 seats. And he's like, yeah, I think we've had somebody trust Christ in every single chair. It's just mind blowing. And the total membership shortly before his death was 5,311. Right now, my favorite stat, craziest stat. Keith, go ahead and read these next two because it's mind blowing.
1891, by 1891, approximately 1 in every 5 Baptist pastors in England were alumni of Spurgeon's College. So indicating a 20% share in the denomination's pastoral leadership. So he had trained 20% of the pastors. So between 1865 and 1887, over half of the new Baptist church in England were founded by Spurgeon and his students. Yeah, that's quite a lot.
I mean, 50% of a denomination in an entire country.
Well, think about it this way. Like, you have church planners now. They're like, they might start one church in their lifetime. It's like to think of like, even like, say like the SBC, which is like the largest, I think, denomination in America. Say like one guy was kind of responsible for half of the churches. Like that would be, astronomical.
Yeah. And he accomplished all this without the internet, without cars.
Without a microphone, like, right? I mean, before even like radio. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that the big takeaway as we close is just like, now Spurgeon admittedly he worked himself to death. He was like, I'm going to die early and I do not care. Like, this is all worth it. So you might be able to be like, when did he rest? I don't know that he did, right? And that just goes to show we're all imperfect. So the point is not simply, I know that you had said somebody was like, well, we'd rather burn out than rust out. And you're like, well, either way you're out. Like, but this idea that Spurgeon considered it all, like he considered everything and was like, hey, I'm going to go all in. And his family, and we see that he loved his family well. He loved his boys well. Like this was not neglecting his family. Like he had his priorities straight. But to me, it was just kind of a challenge of like, man, when I think I'm busy, like when I think it's like, oh, well, I've got a couple meetings today. And like, it's like, no, like really to have that perspective. And Spurgeon really helps provide it. So.
It's huge.
Yeah, so hopefully, if you haven't checked out, the book that I would recommend is Spurgeon by Alex DePrima, which is a really good. There's been a lot of biographies written on Spurgeon. That's a great one. But also too, like you can still purchase some of his writings. They still publish them. His devotions, morning and evening. He wrote a lot of devotions. The Treasury of David is still around. So I encourage you to take and read some of his sermons as well, because it's just somebody else who's a great cloud of witness around us that we can follow them as they follow Christ. So we hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you on the next one.